Welcome to the ADHC Talks podcast, produced by the Alabama Digital Humanities Center at the University of Alabama Libraries. I'm your host, Sara Whitver. This video podcast documents digital humanities research through semi-structured conversations with DH scholars and practitioners. Our guest today is Dr. Jenny Shaw. Jenny is an associate professor in the Department of History here at the University of Alabama. Her research focuses on transatlantic race, labor, and religion. As a member of the University of Alabama's Taskforce on Slavery and Civil Rights, she served as the project manager for the website The History of Enslaved People at UA, 1828 through 1865. This website, hosted by the Alabama Digital Humanities Center, curates documentation of enslaved people who labored on the campus of the University of Alabama.
So, Jenny, I would like to start with a question about you and not about the site. I want to know a little bit about your research, and specifically, this is my favorite question. I like to know what makes people feel nerdy and excited.
Well, my own research, and thank you for asking, is on the 17th and 18th century English Caribbean. I work on questions of race and slavery and gender. And my most recent work, which hopefully will be out by the end of this year, is on a group of 5 women, all of whom had children with the same Barbados enslaver. 2 of those women were his legitimate English wives, who were pretty elite. 2 of those women were women he enslaved, and 1 was a white servant woman on the plantation. Together, they birthed at least 18 children by this man. But what makes me nerd out, I think, about all of these things is that when the second wife died, his wives die sequentially in Barbados, the enslaver returned to England, taking, as the records tell us, his great and numerous family with him. And so the 2 enslaved women and the white servant woman and their children, at least 9 of them, travel with him to England. He dies shortly after he arrives, and they go on to build really remarkable lives in the capital city in London. One of the things that makes me nerd out a lot is the ways in which I've been able to trace their lives, despite the fact that they are so marginalized, despite the fact that we are in the late 17th and early 18th century doing this work, despite the fact that a lot of the things that I look at are extremely old and archaic legal records, sort of civil court cases about the estate of the enslaver and how it's being sort of divided up or not divided up among the various recipients in his will, which, by the way, included the enslaved women and their children. It has recipients of property, not as property themselves in that will. And so those are the kinds of things. I am never happier than when I am sitting in the National Archives in Kew Gardens, in just outside of London, with a huge Chancery Court case on vellum, which is animal skin, that is probably 5 or 6 pages long. And each of those pages is at least, let me put this in I was going to say a meter, but at least a yard wide and usually 2 or 3 yards long. That's what I live for, dorky as it is.
I love it. I love it. Thank you for sharing that with us. It's always just, I don't know, it helps me see people, like, see the energy behind somebody's work when we talk about it in those terms. So my next question is, what is your history with digital humanities? And I want to hear how you personally, and then also because you're representing the task force right now, to give me an idea of what the path looked like for each, in whatever order or however overlap that is, that you came to this project.
So I think actually the best way to tell this story is to begin a little bit with the history of the history, as I like to call it. So people have been working on the history of enslaved people at the University of Alabama for a very long time. You can actually read a book from the 1950s that talks about enslaved people on campus, albeit through a prism that isn't one that we would use today. In the early 2000s, Dr. Alfred Brophy from the law school and Dr. Joshua Rothman, who is currently chair of the history department, spearheaded a campaign to have Faculty Senate officially apologize for faculty involvement in enslaving people at this institution. And they both did their own work. Dr. Brophy published some books on sort of the history of slavery at higher institutions of higher education, particularly actually curriculum-based, sort of like what were students learning in classrooms. And that was all really, really important work. The apology happened in 2004. And then I think sort of the next key moment for us in understanding all of this was Dr. Hilary Green, who used to be one of our colleagues here. In 2015, she inaugurated the Hallowed Grounds Tour, which was both an alternative tour of campus focusing on slavery and its legacies on campus, but also a research project. And one of the things that I think that Dr. Green did that was so brilliant is that she really centered the enslaved people themselves. And so as a result of all of that work, a second Faculty Senate resolution in 2018 mandated that UA establish a task force for studying race, slavery, and civil rights at UA. And as you said at the beginning, I was part of that task force, along with many other people across the history department, art and art history, gender and race studies, communications, American studies, New College. I hope I haven't left any departments out. Including staff, the libraries, obviously, and then including staff members and also graduate students who helped us with that research. And so in fall of 2021, I became the faculty member who basically directed the research with 3 graduate students. That was Brianna Weaver from History, Valerie West from Gender and Race Studies, and Catherine Buckley from Library and Information Studies. And our job initially was to simply survey all of the University of Alabama's early administration records. So we're talking about materials that were produced basically before 1865, or at least that's the cutoff. We were looking at the period of slavery here at UA, and to try and identify every enslaved person that we could who was referenced. And so we were building on the brilliant work of Dr. Hilary Green. We were aided in our task by the amazing Dr. Kate Matheny, who was Special Collections Librarian at Poole, and who ensured that we did not miss a document, who ensured that we understood how to access and read those documents, and who just provided support in a million different ways. So if it wasn't for her, this also would not be the way it is. And so initially, actually, we did not have a digital history project. So it's in some ways, it's a really easy answer, because the answer is there was no plan. However, I was working with some really brilliant students. I have no background in digital humanities. I benefit from them frequently in my own work or in classes with students, but I had never been part of one where I was part of a team creating something. And so in fall of 2021, as we realized how many people we were identifying and, crucially, how many records keyed to each of those people, essentially we realized, hey, we need some way to organize this information. And Catherine Buckley, our brilliant Library and Information Studies grad student, said, I think an Omeka-S platform would be great. And Dr. Matheny said, I think an Omeka-S platform would be great. And I spoke to Dr. Green, who said, I think an Omeka-S platform would be great. And so I did not know what that was prior to them all suggesting it. But that's what we use, because it's a platform that allows you to both enter lots of information about individuals and clock all different kinds of things about their lives and biographies, but that also allows you to connect people relationally to one another really easily. At least that's my understanding of one of the benefits of this platform. And that's what we started doing. And it was essentially through the process of doing that that we began to see just how much material we had. And I also understood, because I had been told, that you could essentially turn that database of information into a public-facing website. And so in February of 2022, I sat in this office with Catherine Buckley, and I just said, because I had no idea what's possible here. And she thought about all of this brilliantly. The fact that the site is as user-friendly as it is really down to Catherine. She was such an expert in all of that. And she basically, we had a conversation, we talked about different elements that could go into the website. And she said, well, give me 2 weeks and I'll show you a prototype. And she did. And It was amazing, even in its prototype form. And that's when I realized, oh, this is something that not only could happen, needs to happen, and we can then double down on our efforts to then produce something like this website. So that's a sort of winding answer, but I don't think you can understand how we came to the project without understanding the history of why we were investigating enslaved people at UA in the first place. And that's why the history I'm a historian. I'm going to give you the history background.
I want the history background. It helps us contextualize. And I love hearing how the task force was able to make it such an interdisciplinary project. It was a history-based project, but there are so many different perspectives contributing to it and so many different backgrounds. And the fact that a library school student was able to bring all of that sort of pragmatically and like in an applicable, like have a vision for applying it. I love that. And it makes the nerdy librarian in me just so proud of our field.
Yes.
I think I want to hear more about the project. So y'all had a launch. Has it been 2 weeks? I think
so. 2.5 weeks. Yes.
Yeah. And you had a fantastic launch party with standing room only, which so many people have come back to me and they're like, oh my goodness, like there were so many people there. It was amazing. It was just so amazing to be able to celebrate this project and what this project means for not just what you've completed as a task force, but what this opens up, you know? So tell us more about the project. Tell us a little bit about, and you're welcome to share the project. I think some of the things that were presented at the launch are relevant.
So I'm just going to share my screen if that's okay.
Perfect.
So this is the landing page for the Studying Slavery .ua.edu website. And essentially what we wanted to do was create a website that would be really transparent and as user-friendly as possible. And we wanted to ensure that anyone coming to this site, so if you have knowledge and experience with the history of slavery at UA, there are things you can get out of this. If you did not even know that enslaved people worked on this campus, there's an entry point here that will help you understand that. Or if you have a little bit of knowledge and want to know more, then there's lots of tools here to help you do that. So we put together an overview that essentially talks through sort of both the history of slavery here, but also gives a little bit of a sense of sort of what was happening on campus, talking a little bit about the kinds of work overall that enslaved people did and how essential they were. We also included a timeline. This was something that the grad students were really passionate about doing, to try and put this history in the context, not only of sort of the history of slavery at the University of Alabama, but in the broader state of Alabama and in the United States. And so it scrolls through and sort of talks about key moments in UA history, as well as sort of the history of the state and the country. Probably the most significant page is the Their Names page. This is the page where we have entries for all 164 enslaved people that we've identified so far. And so if I scroll down here, you can see all of their names, and you can probably see that they all look like red hyperlinks. And I'm going to use Moses as our example here. Moses was one of the 4 people across the top. Ben, Sam, Moses, and Isaac were all enslaved by the University of Alabama itself. One of the things that we knew before going into the research, but were really able to dig into more by assessing all of those early administration records, was figuring out who was enslaved by the university, who was enslaved by faculty and college presidents and trustees, and who were enslaved by basically people in the Tuscaloosa area who hired out their enslaved people to UA. And of course, in that transaction, it was the enslaver who was being paid for the labor, not the person who was hired out. So Moses is somebody who was enslaved by UA. As you'll see, there's a lot of information. I'm just going to quickly scroll down about Moses. He appears lots and lots of times in President Basil Manley's diaries, which is one of the major sort of source materials and repositories that we have. He's also in the faculty minutes. He shows up in the receipts that we have for various things at UA. And as you can see, in each of these entries, there is a hyperlink and then a set of information. And essentially what we have done is we have hyperlinked to the digital file for every source. And then we have also transcribed that. So if you come to the site and you're not familiar with 19th century handwriting, you can still know what the content is in those pieces of information. And the site is also fully readable. It's ADA compliant as well. And so I'm just going to show you this one so you can see what the original looks like. So this is a list of tools that Moses had in his possession. You can see tools belonging to the college in the possession of Moses. This is at the beginning of Manley's diary number 3, I believe. And you can see that those are all there. And then if we go back here, you can see here they are written out. Now, Moses is someone that we have an awful lot of information about, but that's not true of everybody who's named here on this page. So, for example, Sabra here, who was enslaved in the president's mansion here on campus. You can see there are some entries. She has several children on campus. We have a few entries about the fact that she's a cook, that she's given a knife for the use of the kitchen. And again, if we click on this particular entry, and you can sort of scroll down and see as I go looking for it, because what you see on here it is here underneath the watermark, the kitchen knife. You can see that when we go to a page, there's maybe more on that page than just the little bit we've pulled. So you can also look around. And then once you're in the diary, you can scroll back and forth if you want and see what else is happening around the time that Manley is talking. I also want to spend just a little bit of time talking about their lives page. This is where we try to memorialize at least 4 of the individuals who worked here on campus. And so we picked 4, Moses, Lydia, Peter, and Binky. And I'll just show you Moses because you've already seen the entry for Moses. And this is where we used all of the information that was in the entry that you saw for Moses and a lot of contextual information from the further reading page about the history of slavery in general to really try and write a history of Moses that centers him rather than Manley, who wrote so much about him in his diaries, or any of the other white people who sort of talked about his life. And so we have one of these for each of the people that I mentioned before on their lives page. That further reading, always a work in progress, but these were the most significant things that we used. You can see there's a category for material that have been written about slavery at the University of Alabama, slavery in Alabama more generally, early university and Tuscaloosa history, the broad history of race and slavery. I mean, there could have been thousands of books on that, but we picked the ones that were most relevant. And then a burgeoning field, which is basically sort of a critical university studies field that sort of examines the history of institutions to their history and to their past. And that's also like a really exciting and growing field. And a lot of that work has been very influential. People who come here can learn more about the Taskforce, including the shoulders that we stand on and some of the tools that we used in order to be able to put the website together. And then finally, and possibly really importantly for anyone who wants to get in touch, is our contact address. And sort of we welcome inquiries from basically anyone who's interested in this in any shape, way, or form. So that's the website. That's sort of what we put together. And as I said, the process of it was essentially a lot of sitting in special collections at Hull because some of these documents were not digitized when we began. Some of them were, and some of them were in the process of being digitized, and doing an awful lot of deep dives and reading and rereading and checking and rechecking. And so the graduate students really did phenomenal work there. Brianna Weaver from the history department, she actually looked through a set of administration sort of accounts and receipts that were separate from the ones that were understood to deal with enslaved people. And she found a whole ton of information in there to really help contextualize the kinds of work that enslaved people were doing. And it was really, really amazing in terms of looking at things that on the face of it didn't appear to be about slavery at the University of Alabama, and yet contained within them were things, for example, like the tools that UI was purchasing for enslaved people to use, the clothing that they were wearing, the shoes that they might have had on their feet, occasionally the food that was being purchased. Or things like, the paint for whitewashing the dorms, right? That had to be purchased. We can look at the Manly's diary and see that Moses is whitewashing the dorms on these dates. And then you can see in these receipts that were seemingly not connected, the purchase of the materials for him to be able to do that work. So it allows us to sort of triangulate and scaffold source material to give a much fuller picture of what was actually happening and the processes through which something that on the face of it might seem fairly mundane, like whitewashing a building, but looking to see exactly how that happened here at UA.
That's just incredible. I know that y'all did a lot of digging over at special collections and identifying things that were not digitized, and that you had a host of students helping with that. That I just think that that's just such an amazing, just a model of uncovering this stuff. I think it's kind of, in a way, what y'all were able to accomplish is sort of, it's the dream for a lot of people's projects, in that you were able to scope and find the things that you needed and then execute your vision the way that you did. I know that we've talked about some next steps. I think I would like to hear a little bit about what the task force envisions as, like, next. Would it be next for this project, but also next for the task force's next, big thing that they're going to tackle? I know that those conversations are happening right now. I think one of the things that I see in this website is sort of a foundation for a number of people to be able to discover new research projects. And I love that about this. So perhaps if you can tell me a little bit about the task force aspirations for the website moving forward, and maybe a little bit about the response that you've gotten from it so far. We're 2 weeks in and lots of people have been checking it out. That's a lot of questions.
No, it's fine. I think they're a good one. So I'll talk first about what the aspirations are for the website, and then if I'm allowed, I'll talk a little bit about what the task force broader aspirations are, as I understand. Yeah. And I should say, I'm speaking kind of for the task force, but not in an official way. It's sort of like my engagement. But with the website, I can say that so far the response has been really wonderful, in that students have been engaging the website and been bringing sort of their feedback and their understanding of it to us individually, and then also in classes. So one of the major things, as you said, is that this is a platform, basically, it is a project that essentially is just the base starting point. My hope is that students take this material, find their own research projects, run with it, and that in 10 or 15 years, if we're having this conversation again, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's been uncovered, discovered, found, different ways of interpreting the material than the ones that we have used here on the site, including things that we couldn't even imagine right now as being possibly coming out of this. So one of the desires to make it as transparent, as fully accessible, to go through and ask to have digitized things that were not slated to be digitized because they didn't seem to be of relevance, and to make those accessible, was not because people had not sat in Hoole and gone through these records before. Of course, Dr. Green is one of the people who did that. And she had done her own work in making a lot of that material accessible up through her websites. Our job was to basically do something that we could say was comprehensively examine it all. So the newness is not the content. It's just that we've hopefully managed to put it all in the one place so that you can come through here and then hopefully take it and run with it. So my class, my undergraduate research seminar class, is using the website as we speak. probably. They're working on assignments, so certainly. But 2 other faculty members on the task force are also having their classes use it. One of those is in English and Honours College. The other is in communication. So this is not only a website that can sort of prompt research or interest in the field of history, just as the task force is interdisciplinary. So I hope are the uses of this website. We've talked about the fact that I've not produced, I suppose, or been part of the production of a digital project, but it's not what I do. So I'm really hopeful that there's a bunch of things that I can't even imagine that can be done with this website. So in terms of, for the website going forward, getting people using it, engaging with it, whether it's actually students or people in Tuscaloosa more broadly, West Alabama, the state, the country, whatever that is, that's something that we really want, and we really welcome feedback. If we discover new things, of course, we will be adding them. If we discover errors, we will be correcting them. It's one of the beauties of a digital project is that you can go in and make sure that things are correct. So, for example, it could be something as mundane as somebody reads a entry from the faculty minutes and says, I think you've transcribed that incorrectly, and we can make the correction, hey, we missed this source that links to this person, so now we can add that in. But for the task force more broadly, I think that this website is really seen as phase 1. So the task force sort of charge is an examination of race, slavery, and civil rights at UA. Phase 1 has been to do this comprehensive examination of the slavery part of that. And while that work is ongoing, our brilliant postdoc, my colleague, Dr. Jasmine Stansberry, who's been on the task force for 2 years, she and a new team of graduate students, also interdisciplinary, one from education, one from history, and one from communications, are doing really sterling work, looking at the post-1865 legacy of slavery at UA, looking at sort of the early and mid and then late civil rights era into the Black Power era, actually surveying things all the way down basically into the 21st century. So they're producing a report that should be out, I think, over the summer. But there's so many different avenues that those projects can take and go. And so there's oral history projects in the mix. There's a bunch of different kinds of really exciting work and discoveries. And they're looking at things like all the back issues of the Crimson White. They're looking at the Corolla, which was a magazine here on campus. They're investigating sort of the media that was around basically from the late 19th century all the way forward. And they're coming up with some really amazing things, including, by the way, also identifying some of the people who were enslaved on campus into freedom, which we were able to do a little bit of, but they've also been building some of that. So there's really exciting work. I think this is just the first phase for the task force. I'm excited to see where that goes.
I love that. And I love that you started with Omeka S. And one of the strengths of Omeka S, I don't know if this has even occurred to you, but you can put all of this documentation into the same project and build different sites out. So with portals to different types of content. So the task force can contain a record of all of this work in one central location with the organization that you and the sort of the philosophy and perspective that you've already established, and just make it a comprehensive review of everything that the task force is looking at. And I also think it would be interesting for y'all to consider what happens if someone else that's not associated with the task force but is on campus, or even somebody who is not on campus but wants to partner with you to build out a site using your Omeka project. So actually designating a site that has its own user roles associated with it, and just like see how everything just sort of evolves and blossoms out of this one little hub that you started. I think that there's just like so much potential for it.
Well, I love to hear you say that, because as I said, my main hope is that my mind is going to be blown in future years by what other people do with this information, because that's precisely the kind of thing that, as no expert in this, I don't intuitively know. I understand it now because it's been explained to me, but it wasn't something I went into this.
Right.
I relied on the experts in those areas to say, this is what you need, and here's why you need it. And it has been, I mean, it's been a brilliant platform to work with. And I know we've only scratched the surface of its potential. So my real hope is that other people take that potential and run with it, whether it's the Taskforce doing its thing or people outside. But yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Something that I also think is remarkable that is coming out of the conversation that we have that I want to note for anyone who's watching or listening is that you are a quintessential researcher in digital humanities, in that you come to the project with your own research background and no experience with DH, but a vision of what digital could mean for the materials that you have. And the fact that you were able to, I know it was not you personally only,
right,
but that this team was able to articulate the scope and vision for the project in a way that could be executed and realized, I think it's aspirational, but it's inspirational, because a lot of people shy away from digital humanities because it sounds very techy, you know? It sounds like, oh, I don't do technical stuff. I look at vellum, you know? And they're not mutually exclusive. And digital humanities is such a collaborative, interdisciplinary experience or venture to be on. And the real projects that succeed are truly partnerships between people who have these deep expertises. That's not a word. Have expertise in their field and are able to bring this wealth of knowledge and analytical capability and partnering with people who can translate that vision into a digital artifact that then becomes accessible to other researchers to take and go and pass that baton. And I think that's one of the things that I think is really lovely about your project, because I talk to so many people who would love to start a DH project, but are so intimidated by the fact that they have no technical background. And they're like, you're saying words and I don't even know what they are, you know?
I can say that, yes, I am the poster child for the person who loves the vellum, or at least that's the medium that I play a lot with. That really, really old 17th, 18th century. Obviously, I know how to read an archive of slavery because that's what I work on. So that expertise I could bring, right? I'm working with the graduate students who are building their expertise in that kind of research. That part, that I was totally comfortable with. But what I will also say is that, I mean, my charge to anyone would be, don't be intimidated by it. You do have to have some great collaborators. But as soon as, Anne Lydia McDevitt, actually, your predecessor, she gave me a crash course in how to use Omeka S. And I was up and running, and I was able to then share that with the grad students. So I barely had learned, and then I taught them. And it was actually so straightforward. I think one of the major things that probably cause people to be intimidated by it is this idea that, as you say, it's very technological, that there's maybe coding that has to happen, on more of which in a second, that it's really complicated to set something up, and then to be able to use it and navigate it well. And obviously I can't speak for all platforms, but I feel like a lot of the things that would have been really intimidating 10, 15, 20 years ago just aren't anymore, because these platforms are set up so that people like me with no background can make inroads. Now, were there times when some coding had to happen, and was Catherine the person who did that? Yes, that's why you need the people who really understand. Early on, was Anne Lydia talking a language that I did not understand? Yes. Did she explain it to me? Yes. Do I feel 100% confident that I know exactly what I'm talking about every time I say something about Omeka? No, but I feel like I know enough to understand kind of how it works. Another project that I really should give a shout out to here because they were instrumental and it's on the website and they were acknowledged is Sharon Leon, who's a digital scholar up at Michigan. And she and a team in conjunction with the Mellon Foundation have developed an On These Grounds project. And essentially what that does is that they developed basically a vocabulary, an ontology for the different categories if you're working on institutions that are connected and where you're trying to collect information on enslaved people. So, for example, a lot of the regular sort of categories that you might see in an Omeka choice, and there's lots of different choices you can pick about, which categories you want to sort of include as you're creating an entry for someone. But a lot of them are things like employer, employee, how much is someone being paid in a salary? You don't have to think about things like what's someone's freedom status or who their enslaver is. It doesn't make sense to have employer employee. And so they created a whole vocabulary of terms that we were then able to use in this project. And they made that completely open access and fully accessible, even while they were also developing it on the grant. So that generosity too, that's the other thing. The collaboration was absolutely the grad students and me working on this stuff and the other members of the task force, who, by the way, of course, did so much great work in terms of reading and telling us what was working and making suggestions. Josh Rothman from history, Rachel Stevens from art history, Ellen Spears, who since retired from American Studies, George Daniels from communication. They in particular gave us tons of feedback. Cassandra Smothers, who's in the Division of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, was an absolutely fantastic collaborator on all of this stuff. Lene McDonald from the President's Office also did a huge amount of work in helping us to realize sort of the vision here. So it was also people from outside looking at it and giving feedback and saying, yes, this is working or this isn't, or what about this thing here? Really, really amazing. But beyond the internal sort of UA collaboration, those other scholars out there in the world working with and doing this kind of work and being open and transparent and saying, hey, anyone who wants to use this, please take it. Amazing. Because early on, before On These Grounds had released that vocabulary or ontology, we were sort of scrambling, trying to figure out what made sense. And it was just wonderful when all of the really careful work that they had done, because they also created that with the idea of centering enslaved people and their experience, which was our goal too. And so it was a perfect meld. So collaboration on every level. But I would say to anybody, don't be intimidated. Jump in, the water's great.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Thank you for sharing all of that. Just, I don't know. I think the more we can share about like how a project happened and how much, like how many people had to bring things to the table and share, and the better the future of DH is going to be, because people who come to this and perhaps listen to this episode, who are early in their career, may get some inspiration from that. Even folks who are later in their career who want to do something like this, I think it's really encouraging to really describe what the collaboration is and how it was made possible and how many people had their hands in it.
And I just want to add one more thing, which is that in history, at least, we generally don't work collaboratively. I mean, who you talk to and the people in your field, and you've got friends who read for you, all of that kind of stuff. Occasionally you may co-author something. I've done that once with a good friend, and that was also a really wonderful experience. But generally speaking, we are a solo operation. And it's one of the joy. I'm so glad that I was lucky enough to get to work on this, because this collaboration has been one of the most amazing experiences I've had at the University of Alabama. It was obviously challenging and difficult and frustrating sometimes with what we were working with and what we were trying to achieve. But knowing that you were in it together and having everyone basically be pulling in the same direction was amazing. And to be able to then stand on the shoulders of the people who came before, and then be able to sort of add a little bit more to that was it was such an amazing thing. So to my mind, the collaboration was also in the creation of this website, but in some ways collaborating with people who had done work over decades. Stuff, right? Really using their inspiration as a way to try and get this material organized in a way that was accessible and able to go out there. Yeah, I'm so glad I had the opportunity to do this.
Lovely. Thank you for all of this. I want to invite you to share anything else that we may not have covered. And then I'm going to open to questions from anyone else who's participating, who's joining us.
Well, I think what I'd say is that overall, as I said, I mean, the collaboration has been absolutely key here, including actually right up to the very minute that the website was launched. There were some 11th hour technical things. So you folks over at the library were amazing. You obviously gave us a huge amount of support in the final sort of end run of all of this. Bob Paco managed to make the things that were allowing it not to appear the way it should, really quite late on a Sunday night. So for something like this, it really is all hands on deck and everyone lifting. And as I said, that's part of the reason it's been so wonderful. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about it here. But also thank you for helping the final months of this be as smooth a sailing as it could have been.
This episode of ADHC Talks has been brought to you from the campus of the University of Alabama. This is Sara Whitver. Join us again next time to hear more about DH folks and their super cool projects. Goodbye.